Good morning, Wabash. This week's speaking is Professor Crystal Benedicks. Crystal Benedicks earned her PhD in English Literature from the City University of New York. She's been a member of the Wabash English Department since 2007. Here with her talk titled, "The Shaking Keeps Us Steady," Professor Crystal Benedicks.
Thank you, Ryan, and the members of the Sphinx Club for inviting me here today. It's a great honor. So, a big part of my job is giving advice to student writers, to you. As I prepared for this talk, however, I found myself turning to my students for advice. I asked my freshman writing class, "What makes a good chapel talk?" "Be relatable," they said, "and don't ramble on. If all else fails, fart jokes." I asked my senior seminar class what they thought. Being seniors, they are much more jaded. "Just don't do that thing," they said, "where you tell a personal story and then use it to make some kind of Dead Poets Society type inspirational speech to us." So, to recap, don't be boring, sappy, or self-indulgent. Don't use formulaic structures. Be original. Say stuff that will be interesting to an audience of a different generation and gender. That's a tall order, and I don't even know any fart jokes. Talking to my students, I realized that it's easier to give advice, as I usually do, than to take it, which I am trying to do now, although I give you fair warning that being a professor, I have a weak spot for formulaic structures. In other words, it's easier to help others than to put oneself in the position of being helped. As a teacher, my role is to be helpful, and I'm comfortable with that role because it's a comfortable one. Everyone likes to help others. It makes us feel like good people, gives us that glow of moral satisfaction. Over the past few years, though, I've been re-examining this comfortable role. And here comes a personal story about being a mom, which may not be very relatable to my audience, and which definitely puts me at high risk of self-indulgence, but bear with me. My husband, Professor Jim Cherry of Theater Department fame, and I recently had 3 children, a little boy and twin girls. Since then, I've found myself asking for help more, facing more directly my own vulnerability and lack of control over the world. This happens in practical ways and in midnight existential crisis kinds of ways. On the practical level, we need tons of help caring for the children while we're here, teaching, writing, talking. At this moment, in fact, the twins are probably blissfully finger painting with Professor Cherry's mother while his father picks up our son from preschool. If my parents-in-law didn't, for some unfathomable reason, want to devote their retirement to taking care of our unruly brood, I don't even know if I would be here. Sometimes I can't even get us all out the door in the morning in under 3 hours, and I'll be standing there thinking, I have a PhD, and I'm being outwitted by 3 creatures with the mental capacity of really smart dogs. On a more abstract level, the world has never seemed as random and terrifying and full of lurking dangers as it does when I'm sending my children out into it. Having children means materializing your own vulnerability, removing your heart, and sending it on its way all by itself. As I've faced this new normal, I've been paying more attention to what it feels like to ask for help, and I've been admiring the courage and honesty of students who do so. And that's what I want to talk about today, the problem of how to deal with vulnerability. In our own ways, this is a problem we all face, parents, professors, students, all of us. I've had ample opportunity to reflect on the shared condition of vulnerability in the past few months. Due to some quirk of scheduling, all of the students in my classes this semester are either freshmen or seniors. Freshmen adjusting to the shock of college life with its unrelenting pace and thorny compensatory freedoms. Seniors staring into the murky abyss of real life without the lulling rhythm of registration, classes, papers, rinse, repeat. And if you add to the mix that I'm trying to balance being a mother and a professional at the same time, well, I'm spending my time this semester around a lot of freaked out people, myself included. People who are knocked a little off balance by their lives. People looking for a new stride that will carry them not only upright, but hopefully in some kind of forward direction. As I reflect on how to do this, I come back to 3 key principles that I'd like to share with you. I've already alluded to principle number 1. Principle number 1, the importance of asking for help. At one particularly dark moment after the birth of my first child, I was so tired and overwhelmed that I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Everything felt like an emergency. It was like there was this alarm clock going off right by my ear, and something terrible was always about to happen. And I guess that's the kind of thing that's a survival skill if you're a cave woman being chased by a tiger. But it's not very useful if you're sitting there in a nice, safe house contemplating a little tiny human being who can't even move its own head. Anyway, I knew I needed some serious help, and I was lucky to get it from my generous friends and family and from doctors and therapists who knew how to intervene. The first step to getting help is being honest about our problems, but this is really often unpleasant to do, and most of us are conditioned not to do it. How are you? I'm fine. How's it going? It's all good. When's the last time you answered, or for that matter, asked, that question honestly? Now, I'm not suggesting we all flop around like dying fish and wallow in our insecurities. I'm suggesting that we talk about them with the intelligence and passion and integrity we bring to any of our scholarly endeavors. This is probably one of those cases where being a woman works to my advantage. People expect women to be more vulnerable, more communicative, more helpless. Well, there are obvious problems with that stereotype. It conveys an advantage, too. As a woman, I have fewer social and personal obstacles to overcome to ask for help. I suspect it works in the opposite direction for men. There's some incredibly strong magic spell we all seem to be under, that masculinity equals strength and self-control, and that asking for help implies that you've failed at being a real man. Thou shalt not stop to ask for directions. And seriously, my husband would rather get lost than consult Siri, and she's not a real person. This is a belief that has its fangs in us, even if we are smart and self-reflective and enlightened and know it isn't true. Social stereotypes are incredibly strong. Just think of our Wally Wabash mascot with his bulging muscles and jutting jawline and knowing smirk. Can you imagine him saying, "I feel nervous"? He's tough enough for lots of things, but probably not for that. Studies have shown time and again that men are less likely than women to seek out mental health interventions. For example, in an article published last year, researchers found that college-age men were far more likely than women to think that people who seek treatment are, quote, mentally weak, crazy, unable to handle their own problems, lazy, and different from normal people in a negative way. Yet, men also suffer acutely from mental health issues. According to the World Health Organization, 3/4 of suicides are male. The stakes here are high. Break down the stereotype or go down with the ship. One of the great things that feminism has given me is the ability to name unfair disadvantages and then seek to fix them. I suggest you all do the same. It's a disadvantage that many men feel uncomfortable asking for help. It can be one of the unique contributions of this college for men that you seek to change that. One of the things I admire deeply about this college is that it asks young men to care for each other, to support one another, to listen to one another. You're each other's infrastructure. I think in most coeducational colleges, this experience of care gets triangulated through women who are often placed in that caregiving role. But here you have to, and you get to, occupy that role for one another. Doing that can mean working against those powerful stereotypes. It can mean making sure that your friend goes to the counseling center to see our excellent and hardworking counselors, Jamie Douglas and Kevin Swaim. I know many of you already know this, already do this. I see it all the time. Yet at the same time, I've also talked with students who are clearly struggling, but who reject the notion that they should talk to a professional. But this doesn't make sense. It's like insisting that you don't need to see the doctor for your broken leg. There's nothing weak, lazy, or crazy about breaking your leg, and there isn't anything weak, lazy, or crazy about going to a counselor either. The more men who ask for help without shame, the more possible it will be for all men to do that. Which leads me to principle number 2. Principle number 2, everyone is lame. Okay. Here comes another personal story of dubious relatability. My mother got polio in New York in the 50s during the epidemics there. She was around 5 years old. So many were sick that they opened up old condemned buildings for the patients. She spent months there, contorted and strapped down, an iron lung waiting for her outside the room. Eventually, she recovered, but she has been paralyzed from the waist down since that time. Anyone who meets her notices this immediately, awkwardly. But she's the first person, quite literally, that I ever met, so it took me an absurdly long time to realize how different she is from others. I don't think I truly noticed her as disabled until I was 11 or 12, on the cusp of adolescence. It's a case of not being able to see what is closest to us. And forgive me, but the English teacher in me feels the need to point out here that this is also why we should get someone else to read our papers before we turn them in. Because we can never see what's in front of our face, from wheelchairs to comma splices. So when I did begin to come to terms with the reality of my mother's disability, it was a horrible realization. It was the realization that life is profoundly unfair, and you and the people you love will be hurt by it. While I experienced that realization in terms of sorrow and anger, I've had time to reflect on it since then. And there are some deeply important things I have learned from growing up with a disabled mother. One of those things is about asking for help. Disabled people often don't have a choice about this. I think my mother could have lived in shame at the fact that she couldn't do some really basic things by herself. But she's a practical person, and practical people don't let themselves drown in shame over things they can't fix. My mother makes needing and receiving help look simple and ordinary, as simple and ordinary as it really is. Some of my earliest memories are of helping her, standing on her lap to reach the shower controls at a camping ground we frequented, and doing the same in a voting booth when she couldn't reach the lever. At the same time, my mother is the family authoritarian, the boss, the one you didn't want to piss off. My father has sometimes quipped that she mistakes the wheelchair for a throne. I contemplate these two qualities in my mother, her strength of will and her need for help, her CEO mentality and her vulnerability. And it strikes me that we usually think of these qualities as mutually exclusive. Yet, in another sense, they're a natural pair. You have to have a core of strength to show your vulnerability. Or, put the other way around, the experience of vulnerability forges the clear-eyed strength of realism. But you don't need to have had a disabled mother to see the power in vulnerability. You just need to have had a parent or caregiver at all. Caregivers help children all the time, every second. I helped one of my twin 2-year-olds get her head unstuck from a potty seat the other day. I help them when they get frozen with terror, trying to navigate the unfathomable cliff that is the edge of the couch. I help them when they are so enraged with the intergalactic unfairness of their twin sister getting the xylophone first that all they think to do is throw themselves on the ground in despair. In the same way, my caregivers and your caregivers fed and clothed and bathed and cherished you when you were too little to retain any memory of it, except that it was warm and good. This help is part of the bedrock foundation of love. It is hilarious and intimate, and it forever bonds you. Some scholars who study disability make the claim, I think an important and true one, that most of us feel uncomfortable around visibly disabled people because they carry with them the taint of vulnerability, of needing help. That is, they remind everyone that needing help is part of the human condition, and that just freaks everybody out. But we can refuse to be freaked out and shamed by the very normal human condition of needing help. Some disability scholars argue that disability is not a fixed identity category so much as a state which almost everyone experiences at some point in their lives, although admittedly some stay there longer than others. If you think about it that way, you've entered a disabled state whenever you've had minor surgery or been injured in sports or even had a bad case of the flu. At this point, I can imagine my mother rolling her eyes impatiently and saying something like, "Excuse me, but spraining your ankle isn't the same thing as being in a wheelchair your whole life." And she's right. But this idea of the common disabled state is useful to me because it allows disabled and non-disabled people to plot themselves on the same continuum, to think about how needing care and help and allowance is part of the human condition and not some kind of catastrophic failure. When we suffer in silence, we allow ourselves to be shamed by our vulnerability. When we hide the darkness or sorrow or lack of total perfection in our lives, we're just being vain and untruthful. The human condition is not one of wholeness and flawless self-control. Pretending it is just makes everyone feel bad about themselves, and the whole vicious cycle of shame starts over again. So at this point, we've come to the final principle for dealing with vulnerability, which is also my sappy Dead Poets Society type inspirational speech. Okay, principle number 3, this too shall pass. The point of this section is that periods of vulnerability and even crisis come and, thankfully, go. It's something I remind myself of as my own professional and writing deadlines creep ominously close, or when the twins are tag team sick for 2 weeks. I'm sure as you hunker down for the last few weeks of classes that you are saying this to yourselves too. It won't last forever. The semester is almost over. There isn't much that doesn't look and feel very different if you give it a few months. I can pretty much sum up this point in a simple story about my son. Not that long ago, he was a little baby who literally peed on his own face. Now, just the other day, he learned that essential manly art of peeing standing up. What I'm trying, yeah. I hope he never YouTubes this. So what I'm trying to say here is that the thing you're struggling with will get easier to bear. You'll get better at it. You'll hone your aim. Now, I want to be honest. In an early draft of this talk, this section was called "It Gets Better." And a lot of times it does, but a lot of times it doesn't too. People like narratives of success and overcoming and victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. It's great when that happens, but the very fact that we tell ourselves these stories so often hints at a starker reality we are at pains to hide. Sometimes the story isn't about success, but about change, learning, making the kinds of painful alterations and unlooked-for compromises that reality demands of us. Freshmen who are navigating the adjustment to college become seniors who are navigating the realities of the job market. So the takeaway is not "it gets better," but "it gets different." The challenges change, the angle tilts. The moment you figure it out, it becomes another creature altogether. I want to leave you with the words of one of my favorite poets, Theodore Roethke. Around the time polio struck my mother, Roethke published what would become one of his most famous poems. It's called "The Waking," and no one can really agree what it's about, except that it has to do with figuring out how to live in a mysterious and unknowable world. I'll read you the last stanza. This shaking keeps me steady. I should know. What falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. I love the ambiguity and contradictions there, falling away yet staying near, sleeping and waking, shaking and steadiness. Roethke doesn't try to resolve these. He just lets them stand, beautiful and absurd, linked as much by sound as sense. Roethke himself suffered from myriad mental and physical illnesses. He was hospitalized for several mental breakdowns. He knew about being off balance. For him, as for all of us, imbalance, not perfection, is the natural state to which we return again and again. As I've argued here, we share this state of imperfection. We must ask for help when it gets too much to bear. And we must never forget that we are all in this together. We can find solace and even strength in our vulnerability, the strength to live with ambiguities, to own our disabilities, to learn by going where we have to go. Thank you.